Hello, and welcome to the webinar presented in collaboration with the Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia MGMAs. My name is Erin Kimes, and I will be your host. Today's presentation is led by Nick Hernandez from Avista LLC. Nick is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and a former captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. He holds MBA degrees in both Operations Management and Information Technology and E-Business Management from Wake Forest University. He is board certified in Healthcare Management and has been named a Fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives. Nick is a frequent guest lecturer and a former member of the Board of Directors of the Society for Radiation Oncology Administrators. Nick is also a frequent contributor to many healthcare publications. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how to participate. The viewer window is on the right, and it allows you to see everything the presenter shares on their screen. The control panel is on the left. That is how you can participate in the webinar. The audio panel provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar using microphone and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio using your telephone by selecting Use Telephone under the audio drop-down box. The dial-in information will be displayed along with the audio pin. During the presentation, you can send questions through the chat box found on the left side of your screen. Simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session to respond to as many questions as possible. As a reminder, we are recording today's webinar. You can view the recording on participating MGMA websites. Now, please welcome Nick Hernandez.
Well, thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your busy schedules to jump on a webinar. I'm a former private practice administrator, so I know how busy these days can get. And so, again, I'm glad that you were able to carve out a little time. So that being said, we'll jump right into it. I'm going to try to allow plenty of time for questions when it comes to succession planning. There's no two practices are the same, so there may be some individualized, personalized questions, and that's what we're here for. I also don't know, the makeup of the audience. Some of you are no doubt private practice. Some of you may be hospital-owned practices. Some of you may have multiple physicians, and some of you may be with a solo private practice, solo physician group. So I'm going to try to generalize this talk to tailor it to all those different nuances. So some may be applicable to you, and some of the information may not. So with that being said, so when we talk about succession planning, while planning for retirement or perhaps contemplating a reduced role or an ownership transition, while any of those things may seem like something that is years away, the reality is that positioning your practice to, maximize value and to minimize disruption, those things can take a great deal of time and some careful planning. And as many physicians have discovered, failure to prepare adequately can really be extraordinarily damaging to the practice. Not only can physicians subject themselves to unneeded financial stress, but also mental stress, but furthermore, the practice itself can actually struggle if this hasn't been thought through. And as a former administrator, I believe that only physicians can truly set the culture of a physician practice. And it's in succession planning that strong physician leadership, in addition to you all on the call as practice managers, it's critical to sustain and to grow the business, especially in this very complicated healthcare industry that we have today. So when you're balancing patient care, balancing entrepreneurialism, partnership, business development, all these are reasons why physician owners and practice managers should worry about succession planning. So leadership, and when I talk about leadership, I mean both physician owners and administrators. I have always felt that back in the day that I was a key part of that leadership for the practice. So when it comes to physician leadership, leadership transitions, they're risky times for medical practices. For example, when you have a departing lead physician who has had a strong run, there oftentimes is worry about the successor's ability to maintain that momentum. On the flip side, if that lead physician has performed poorly, there's anxiety about whether and how fast the physician successor would be able to correct course. Now, physician owners are responsible for ensuring that the practice continually has high-quality operations and employees. And one of the most important pieces to meet this responsibility is to conduct successful succession planning. I'm a big advocate of strategic plans. Hopefully everybody out there does them frequently. And having a strategic plan that clearly conveys the practice's mission and its current strategic priorities is essential. Your strategic plan should include specific actions that detail who is going to do what and by when in order to address each of the priorities that you have in that current strategic plan. Now, succession planning isn't something you can do once and forget. That's the bad news. It is also advisable, from my standpoint, that you have at least annual discussions with key employees, department heads, as well as you and the physicians, of course, having those annual discussions regarding succession planning, including how you're going to manage effectively during that transition. That doesn't always happen. I realize that. I get called in usually at the 11th hour when we need to move this forward quickly. But I'm trying to give you best practices would really to have those annually. So when talking to others about that succession, realism must be your foundation. Obviously, having a clear leader is key, but this is no time for wishful thinking, okay? You don't want to hope that an uninterested or incapable physician will suddenly become full of passion and business skills. It's not going to happen. You need to objectively evaluate, ideally with the help of some knowledgeable outsiders, evaluate those physician candidates for both their experience and their potential. And after that tough decision, you need to take the systematic steps to pass the reins of leadership. And we're going to talk about that again at the very end. So this may take some time, but remember, the best successions that I see are those that end with a clean and certain break. In other words, after you give up the reins, get off the wagon. So we've all are aware, or at least have read about, if it's not impacting you yet, this physician shortage. We've got this growing physician shortage across the country, and it's making physician recruiting a top priority for healthcare organizations. When I say organizations, I mean both private practice and hospital owned. But oftentimes, recruiting, especially physician recruiting, is just solely an administrative task. And the problem is that recruiting efforts at this level, physician recruiting efforts, they're easily short-circuited, I guess you could say, by physician dynamics. Every physician is different in your practice. Short-circuited by resource problems. We don't have enough money to do X, Y, and Z. And short-circuited by organizational inertia. That's a fancy way of saying we as managers have so much going on, we don't even have time to think about physician recruitment and succession planning. So what happens when leadership, again, you're included in this, what happens when leadership takes this hands-off approach to physician recruiting? For starters, we get physician resistance. With their practice base and income at stake, physicians often have a good reason to be suspicious of attempts to bring in new providers. And if you have physicians who are struggling, let's say, to build their practice, they have a strong incentive not to assist with your recruiting efforts. And in some cases, I've flat out seen physicians simply refuse to cooperate with recruitment efforts. The second thing that can happen when leaders take a hands-off approach to physician recruiting is inadequate resources. To be competitive in today's environment, practices, private practice as well as hospitals, they need to make a significant financial investment in recruiting. Now that's in terms of both physician compensation that we know, but also recruiting tools, advertising, perhaps even hiring a recruiter. And the lack of top leadership involvement is going to translate directly into inadequate funding. Everybody, you have to get the buy-in from the owners of the practice, bottom line. And finally, the third thing that happens when leadership takes a hands-off approach to physician recruiting is you get this uphill battle to align support. So effective recruiting programs, and by that I mean practices that do a really good job at recruiting, okay? They have a well-defined program, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Effective recruiting programs depend upon the cooperation of people throughout your practice, all the way from the top to the bottom. And without leadership involvement, physician recruiting just becomes everybody's lowest priority. So the problems begin, and we'll talk a little bit about recruiting for those that may be solo practice that need to bring in physicians, or perhaps if you're actually going out there to build up your bench strength, if you will. So I wanted to spend a little time on this as well because it feeds into the succession planning that we'll wrap up with. So the problems begin when recruiting becomes, just another item on the agenda. But the keys to changing this, a lot of it lies with you as the manager, are individual vision and a structured accountability, holding people accountable to the different wickets of recruiting. And leaders need to recognize that physician recruiting is a critical challenge and formally communicate that to the practice, that is, that recruiting is a top priority. If you treat it as an ad hoc item, task that the practice is undergoing, everybody will treat it as such. If you make it a big deal, it will become a big deal. As leaders, we need to establish some clear recruiting responsibilities. Who's responsible for doing what, and it shouldn't just be lying on the shoulders of the administrator. But you should also assign specific accountabilities covering the development of things such as a strategic recruiting plan, as well as short-term goals and long-term recruiting goals. And you also need to make sure that you require formal reporting on recruiting activities. Think about if you've implemented an EHR and it became a very formalized process, hopefully, on the different activities in order to do the implementation. This is, and reporting back to make sure as a project that we were able to move things forward. This is exactly what we're talking about when it comes to recruiting. It's not just a one-off. And as a result, this combination of a commitment and also accountability, that combination is going to create a sustained leadership focus on physician recruiting. It's an ongoing thing. You should always be looking. I'm using my air quotes. You should always be looking, seeing what's out there, seeing when you're looking at your competitive analysis and your strategic planning, is there a hole that we could perhaps fill with a new body, so to speak? Do we have succession planning going on that we need to be looking? If you think you're going to start recruitment and find a doctor in 6 months, I can tell you that 99 times out of 100, that will not work that soon. So for a physician recruiting program to be successful, individuals from throughout your practice, bottom line, everybody needs to work together. And that leadership involvement is critical to ensuring a widespread cooperation and a tactical coordination. It's really important that the administrator be involved in the physician recruiting process and that it doesn't just lie in the hands of the physicians. So with regards to that tactical coordination that I just mentioned, one key tactical area is the actual candidate interview. So successful recruiting organizations, and again, those that do a really good job at recruiting, they have developed what I would call a well-organized interview process, which is capable of producing some pretty solid hiring decisions, but most importantly, on a timely basis, because as I mentioned earlier, it's an ongoing focus that is attributed to recruiting. So to create this effective interview process, your organization, you need to develop evaluation criteria for all candidates so that we can compare apples to apples, just like you would compare software. And then you need to define some decision responsibilities across the organization as they're coming in for different things, even so much as somebody setting them up in a hotel and coordinating their travel when it comes later down the line, and who's going to take them out to dinner, and who's going to be there, and who's going to give them the tour, who's going to have them go out and meet referring physicians. And as administrators, you all need to ensure that the physician interviewers use that criteria that you've established. That way you're comparing apples to apples from one candidate to another to assess those candidates. And perhaps equally important, if not more so, is that they provide prompt feedback to you. So think about the process. You're advertising, maybe you're screening CVs, you're doing phone interviews, somebody comes on for a visit, maybe one time, second visit, different stages to this. You need to get prompt feedback from those that are involved. So if you have a candidate and all of a sudden, some point in time through the process, you realize, this one's not going to work out. You need to know about that so you can cut them loose and move on. Let's not waste time on them. Similarly, if you have a physician that looks right, smells right, walks right, all that kind of stuff, that we expedite this process to get them in for on-site interviews, et cetera. There's no need to drag it out. But the only way that we can do that as administrators is we have to get prompt feedback from those that are involved in the process, including the docs. And as administrators, we also need to make sure that physicians cooperate, all of them, in making the recruiting visit a good experience for candidates. And that can be a problem sometimes if we have a disgruntled physician or a senior physician that is facing an exit strategy. And these visiting physicians, the candidates, they need to meet with a mix of everybody in your practice. Again, if you're a private practice, hospital administrators, department chairs, frontline physicians, nursing staff, you name it. And that everybody needs to be prepared to welcome these physician candidates with a positive attitude and constructive information. We've all interviewed for jobs before. Nobody wants to work for a place that just seems demotivating from the get-go. So everybody needs to be on the upbeat so that we can put our best foot forward and hopefully get the candidate that we need. So only top leaders, physicians and yourselves as managers, and in particular some of the physician ownership, only those people can overcome staff resistance to a planning process. Now, physicians, I may be preaching to the choir in this statement, but physicians that are near retirement are famously silent about their plans, often forcing administrators to guess about upcoming staffing needs. I bet there's a bunch of head nods right now. In addition, dissatisfied physicians will often refuse to cooperate with efforts to develop recruiting plans. And that's why I say that a leadership commitment throughout an extended period, not an ad hoc thing, it's an ongoing initiative, if you will. That is what is key to demonstrating that your practice does not intend to recruit around physicians, to be a part of the process, and also that the practice will support the current staff through any temporary volume declines that are caused by new providers joining the practice. And while a certain amount of pressure is sometimes necessary from administrators, physicians do tend to self-police themselves on staff development planning, assuming that you get the senior physicians behind the process. And again, by making this an ongoing initiative, never ending, if you will, so to speak, that is where you get this buy-in, if you will, from those key physicians. And ultimately, a strong commitment by the top leaders, that's what's going to create what I would like to call a culture of recruiting. And that is an organization in which everyone understands the importance of physician recruiting, and everyone cooperates with conceiving, planning, and implementing, of course, an effective recruiting program. Because make no mistake about it, as the competition for physicians continues to heat up and organizations across the country become more sophisticated at wooing them, a culture of recruiting, I believe, may become as important as a culture of quality, or a culture certainly of financial sustainability, because those are things that physicians help bring on board, right? Quality and financial stability. And places where physician recruiting is a top-level leadership priority, those are the ones that stand the best chance of building this critical organizational culture. So a little bit about development. The next couple of slides, oftentimes I get asked for some specifics about buy-ins when it comes to succession planning and partnership. There is no standard, and it would certainly be hard for me to say that to you guys on a webinar, because again, we've got different sizes of groups, different locations around the country, different specialties. Okay, a buy-in and a buy-in buyout for a solo practice internal medicine is completely different than a 10-physician radiology practice because of the equipment involved, perhaps because of the locations, things like that. And then, of course, there's just some culture that is involved in there, where sometimes physicians have built into their governance documents how much and how a buy-in, buyout would be, and how it is actually structured. Not that we can't tweak that going on. But when I get asked about what is the standard, ultimately there is no standard, unfortunately. So some practices, as an example, they would retain some earnings as time goes on to purchase equipment, maybe to purchase buildings, etc. However, if the practice has never retained earnings and thus has zero or minimal fixed assets, like the stereotypical internal medicine practice, if you don't have any buildings, then really the only assets your physicians own is a piece of the AR, the accounts receivable. So with regards to that, there are a number of AR, accounts receivable, buy-in, and run-out formulas. Buy-ins may be dependent on sweat equity, goodwill, or initial income guarantees. Accounts receivable run-outs, though, at termination, like when the doctor leaves, they're usually not more than 90 days. Beyond that, you put a kind of an end date to it, and so we're not dragging this out forever, so to speak. But regardless of how you structure this plan, or if you already have something in writing and that's what you're running with, regardless of that, as administrators, it is insanely important that you move the process along. Think about the wedding and someone getting cold feet. It's difficult, very difficult, to have senior physicians lingering on because of strategic decisions to stay, that stay on hold, and they continue to focus on their buyout. Basically just continue to negotiate this to the 11th hour into the umpteenth degree. Now, as for some practical considerations, If you can use outside help, you should include a consultant with every official meeting that you have with buy-ins and the founders. So third parties, they provide a legitimacy to your process. And also, they take the hard hits for difficult messages, right? Just like we would use recruiters if you can afford to, because they're an intermediary type person. But either way, whether you outsource, you bring somebody on, or you're going to do it yourself, you need to be prepared to spend a lot of time on this project, succession planning. It's not easy. You're going to encounter many agendas from the physicians from different aspects, perhaps even accountants and lawyers. But if you stick with it, which I would suggest, it's just an imperative process to the success of the practice. But you've got to keep moving forward. The longer these negotiations and discussions linger, the more questions that arise, and the harder it is to kind of, quote, sell it emotionally, because it does indeed get stale. And lastly, I'll sometimes ask about, buy-in, buy-out plans. What do they look like? I kind of alluded to some of this earlier. It's all over the board. I mean, I have seen things from just a matter of a few $1,000s to cover legal fees and discussion of AR, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of dollars and valuations of the practices with lots of equipment in multiple locations. That being said, if you pin me to the wall, I would say that many times I would see something like 2 years to a partnership track. After that, 5 years to full equal partnership with other senior physicians, of course, who are diluted. Graduated ownership over those 5 years, possible board seat, depends on how big your practice is, maybe no distributions during that period, perhaps not. And sometimes it could be as long as 10 years for full vesting for exit. And again, that generally speaking is a little bit on the larger practice side of things. So let me tell you how I approach this as I get called in to work with practices, and maybe this will help you as you're dealing with partnership type discussions. So in this particular scenario, what we're really talking about is you have, it's not recruiting, so you've already got some junior physicians maybe on board, and you need to talk about partnership and how we're going to move that forward, because ultimately that's feeding into the succession plans. The first thing that I do is I sit with that senior physician. If you have multiple physician owners, I like to talk with all of them on a one-on-one basis, so I don't get everybody nodding their head in agreement, even though they don't agree. If we're talking about an exit strategy for one senior physician, then of course that's the one that's going to get bought out now. Then it's really important that we have that conversation. One-on-one, what is it that they're interested in? What do they think that the value should be based off of? Over what time period? Are they going to include goodwill? Are they going to include the building? If you guys own buildings, a lot of times the senior physicians may not want to do that. They may want to keep it themselves so they can be a landlord. Over what time period are they going to phase out? And how are they going to phase out? Meaning like over 6 months, they're going to start whittling down, and then a year and a half, and then ultimately they're going to be out when? 2 years from now? 5 years from now? 10 years from now? When's their last day? And then I go, just like a mediator, go and I talk to the junior physician, okay? Physician already on board, but not yet partner. What is it that they want? When do they want to take control of the reins? When would they like to see the senior physician exiting? What kind of control would they like to see as far as being able to sign documents, taking ultimately over the practice? And if we have huge daylight between these two, then we have a lot of work to do, a lot more so than if these two are on the same sheet of music. The next thing to talk about is valuations. And I'm sure everybody's hopefully at least heard of that. Maybe you've even been through them before. Essentially, we're talking about how much is the practice worth. That's what a valuation is. Now, best practices would be to do a valuation when the junior physician starts work, or technically right before they start work, so that you have a benchmark. You have a point in time, a snapshot in time of how the practice is operating financially. And then you've got your junior physician, and let's say they're on a 2-year partnership track. And it comes time to do the buy-in 2 years later. We value the practice again. Why do we do that? Well, hopefully, if the junior physician has carried their weight, that practice will have grown. And so it's not fair to the junior physician, and they would certainly argue, if you just did evaluation, that second one, and try to base the buy-in on that. Especially if we're talking about goodwill. Now, goodwill, if you're not familiar with that, is basically the term to say, I as a doc, what do I bring to the practice, right? I mean, all the referring physicians love me. I've been at this practice. I started this practice. I've been here for 30 years. Everybody loves me. That's a lot of goodwill. It should be worth something. Fair enough. We have to figure out what a value on that. But what about the junior physician? Did that junior doc not build any goodwill at all during the past 2 years? I bet you they would argue they did. I bet you they have some referring physicians that refer solely or primarily to that junior physician. So you have to, and that's, goodwill is just one example, but you would have to back that out of there. Now, if you don't do an initial evaluation, and that is the case more often than not that I see, it's okay. It's a little bit harder, but we can go back and look at documents, if you will, to kind of picture where before the physician started and look at a few things. Financially, it's usually easier. Referring trends, depending upon how you track your referrals, could be a little bit more difficult to do that, which is why I like to set it up in the beginning. And then once we have this, ultimately, we're talking about structuring then the partnership. We get a deal on paper. Somebody needs to deliver and negotiate that between the senior doc or docs and the junior physician. Again, I would recommend that is a third party for several reasons. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, that there's no bad blood. You have somebody coming in, they can take the hits right on the face, and at the end of the day, there's no bad blood between it. But think about it from this standpoint. A lot of times you'll go to a practice, and the administrator has been there maybe since the beginning, maybe 10, 20, 30 years. And the administrator has been charged with going back and forth between these docs and negotiating the offer. If you're the junior doctor, wouldn't you not question the loyalty of the administrator? Been there for 30 years. I would think that their loyalty probably is with the senior physician. That's one of the reasons why if you go to an intermediary person, you can help to avoid that particular process. Because at the end of the day, if this deal goes through, what are we talking about? Ultimately, the senior physician will eventually exit, and you, as the administrator, will now be working with this, quote, junior physician who has the reins and the keys to the car. So lastly, I want to leave you with some tips for transition of power, if you will. We'll try to finish up early before we have plenty of questions. So these two big bullets here kind of have a couple of bents to it. So first, let's talk about on this one. Really, we're talking about you're not really doing any recruiting. We're literally just talking about succession planning and how we're going to move forward. So what I like to do, and I would suggest that you do, is you have very structured meetings with an agenda, and somebody, you or consultant, is actually facilitating those meetings. Just as we mentioned earlier on, that succession planning needs to be not only ongoing, but it needs to be formal. We're trying to communicate this as a big deal. When it comes to succession planning, ultimately, we're talking about what? We're talking about the lead doctor who is leaving. Maybe hard for them to leave, maybe they're quasi being forced out, what have you. And as the owners of the practice, they will come up with all sorts of reasons why, yeah, we can't keep that meeting, we need to bump it a couple of weeks, as we've seen with a bunch of other things in our practice. If you have somebody flying in to facilitate that meeting, it's a little bit harder for them to move it. And if it's an ongoing process, we're always constantly having these to discuss how this works and train up the junior physician that I'll talk about in a minute. Then it becomes a kind of a part of the process. Just like, again, if you were implementing an EHR and you would have weekly and monthly meetings as far as moving that process forward. That's really what we're talking about here. Structure. Having a formalized agenda so that if you're meeting monthly or quarterly, certainly no less frequent than quarterly, probably no more frequent than monthly because there's too much going on, and talk about what it is that we're going to do as far as training. And what I mean by that is we have the new doctor, the junior doctor, if you will, not new, the junior partner teaching them about financial analysis, right? Some of the financial reports, going over how that works, talking about payer contracting, talking about credentialing, two separate items, talking about working with the accountant and things that the accountants need for taxes, talking to them about HR, some of personnel issues that we have from a corrective standpoint, as well as performance evaluation. It's really about training that new physician so that you can slowly hand off the reins to the new doc who's going to be answering all your questions, ultimately banging the gavel down, if you will, and signing all the documents that the new owner needs to sign. It's not fair to do that if they don't have the tools and they're not brought up to speed. So those are the things that we're talking about. In addition, as time goes on, and some of those meetings would bring the accountant in, because this particular meeting we're going to talk about certain things for the accountant, maybe filing for taxes, or maybe you're doing a loan for some new build-out. But similarly, as time goes on, and people need things from the owner, again, I'll just stick with the accountant as the example. The accountant calls up, maybe talks to you, maybe you need to talk to the physician, however your relationship works in your group. That call, that question, if you're fielding it, needs to go to the new doc. We talked about giving up the reins and getting off the wagon. That's the only way you can separate the senior, the outgoing physician, from the junior, is by giving those new questions to the new doc. Ultimately, they can all talk about it, etc. But as time goes on, those questions need to get fielded to the new doc. You don't want to wait until after the senior doc has left and we're trying to call up the founder who's on vacation somewhere in India to answer a question, how does this work? It's too late then. And similarly, as time goes on, as you set up all these timelines, we would slowly wean off the outgoing doc from signing things and the new doc for signing things. Not necessarily all at once for two reasons. It can be overwhelming for the new doc, and it could seem like it's a little bit of a slap in face to the senior physician. So set up timelines as time goes on, depending upon what you're doing. Maybe you do a formalized budget every calendar year and it needs to get signed off in December, and that may be something the new doc starts. And you're working on payer contracting coming up, but that won't be until the spring. And so maybe that is when, between now and then, the senior doc signs things, but the new doc will pick it up at that point in time. Same thing with regards to employee performance evaluations, reviewing them, signing off on them, all those kind of things. We need to lay out in a timeline. So we're transitioning, and I know power can seem like an ugly word, but for lack of a better term, it's really what this is. We're transitioning the power. We're handing off the wand from the outgoing physician to the new physician, structured, timelines, written in stone. Now, the next bullet point, this one about transition timelines spelled out, applies to that, but also specifically if you're bringing on board new physicians. So here's my tip. This is what I consider to be kind of best practices. You need to recruit a new doc. So as we're talking to these docs, what I like to do, the candidates, what I like to do is I say we prepare an LOI, a letter of intent. It's non-legally binding, one page, simple, bullet point. Talk about what we expect from a partnership standpoint / succession planning, how that's going to go. We're looking for a partner. We anticipate that, I'm making this up, we anticipate that the partnership track is going to be 2 years. From after that, you'll maintain full partnership, or you'll get the full partnership a year after that. With the buy-in, we expect to be based off of goodwill and AR. The senior physician, Dr. Hernandez, in year 2021, will start to phase out immediately with going down to 4 days a week. A year later, down to 3 days a week, etc. We anticipate being the key word in that LOI. So this does a couple of things. One is it helps to set the stage mentally from a succession planning standpoint. It helps to set the stage mentally for the senior physician. Here it is. Here it is. We're starting to put it in writing. But it also helps from a candidate standpoint. You know, there's a lot of candidates, especially in certain specialties, where they're not looking to be a partner. They just want to be an employee. Well, if you're looking for a partner, and if you're hiring for a future partner, and the candidate only wants to be an employee, well, that's a problem. We need to let that be known, and figure that out from the very get-go. Similarly, let's say, for example, you're hiring for a partner. The candidate wants to be a partner, but the timelines don't jive, not even close, right? You're thinking that this is going to be a 5-year partnership track, be full partner in 10 years, and we're not even talking about exit strategy for the senior doc. And the candidate, he's an aggressive guy, young. He wants partnership in 2 years, full partnership in 4, wants the reins in 5. I've seen those. That's a lot of daylight between those two. We should really figure that out from the get-go to see whether or not this marriage is going to work. And really the only way to do that, to drive the point home, is to kind of put some of those bullet points in writing. Again, it's not a legal thing. It's just a document from a letter of intent standpoint. And it's not sensitive in nature, so you can certainly disclose those with any candidates that you're recruiting. And ultimately, to the next bullet point, candidate comes on board. At some point in time, you start the actual partnership negotiations. Now, here's where we talked about earlier. We're going to talk about not only how the valuations and how the buy-in and buyout is done, but we're also going to talk about this transition of power, things that we thought we might do in the LOI a couple of years ago. Now we're actually going to write out. And unfortunately, a lot of practices don't do this, by the way. They do their partnership documents for governance, and none of the stuff that I'm about to say is ever written. And this is where succession planning becomes a problem. I suggest that we have a separate document that outlines the timeline for a transition of power, which may include the exit strategy, the date of a senior physician or physicians, and we put it in writing. Dates, specific dates, not 6 months. I mean specifically March 31st of 2019. And we hold everybody accountable to that. Because remember when I mentioned about the structured meetings earlier, we're going to have facilitated structured partnership meetings. The administrator should be there as well. And when January 1 rolls around, and that's when the senior physician and everybody agreed that the senior doc would go down to 4 days a week, they're down to 4 days a week. It's not negotiable. And hopefully as an administrator, you've prepped for that ahead of time in order to wind down. But there is no wiggle room. Because if you allow wiggle room, as a senior doctor sees that light at the end of the tunnel, then they start getting antsy and they want to drag it out. Similarly, the younger doc, hey, a deal's a deal. I wanted the key to this car. Let's not change the terms now. And that gets into some of this post-partnership that we actually are holding everybody accountable to what happens in those meetings, how the baton is handed off, and there is no wiggle room for those dates. Those should have all been thought out a long time before in those agreements. So hopefully that makes a little sense, but we can answer questions at the end. So in summary for today's talk, the bottom line is that a well thought out succession plan, one, as I mentioned, that's crafted well in advance, consultation with multiple outside people, your practice attorney as well, accountant, doing all of that kind of stuff helps to avoid unnecessary legal issues, right, between partners, unnecessary financial issues. And those are the things that can appear during periods of transition. But I firmly believe that a well-executed, so not just having that plan, but that last slide we talked about how to carry it out, a well-executed succession plan is going to maximize your assets. It's going to protect the practice and its partners. You know, it's also going to preserve the founder's legacy, and those are things I like to explain to the outgoing physician. And it's going to ensure that senior physicians are actually rewarded for a lifetime of hard work. So we finished up. We got about 15 minutes, and I guess we can go ahead and get questions while people are maybe loading things up. Here's my contact information. Again, I'm a former administrator. I know you guys are busy. Feel free to hit me up on an email. Give me a call. If you've got any questions that are specific to your practice, there's no boilerplate answer to anything. And if you're on social media, those are the four that we're on.
Thank you, Nick. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat box, and Nick is here to answer them for you. We do have somebody typing at the moment, Nick. I'm not sure you can see that.
Yeah, I see the little gray box.
Okay.
Coming. Yep.
Oh, maybe not.
Yeah, so the question, I don't know if everybody can see the chat box, but can you compare the difference between academic practices versus private practice? Yes, so academic as well as actually hospital-based practices, a lot of times if we're talking about succession planning, that is the same because we're really talking about handing off the wand. But if you're talking about from valuations and buy-ins, buyouts, and partnership opportunities, those are pretty different. One of the biggest reasons is that academic practices don't have any assets. Academics do, but usually not the docs. So doctors are actually employees. So from a partnership standpoint, they may actually just be employees of the academic institution. If it's a hospital-based practice, sometimes they may actually be like a medical group, so to speak. So again, there's usually not necessarily assets involved, so it's more of an AR issue, but they still may have partnership tracks that are available in that from a hospital standpoint. Private practice, it's all the above. You may have assets, hard assets, clinical assets, like an X-ray machine, et cetera, depending on your specialty, as well as I mentioned earlier, buildings. So in academics, they're not going to be owners of the buildings. Neither is the hospital from a medical group standpoint, because they probably all separated that when they joined the hospital. But in private practice, there may be real estate involved, equipment that's involved. But usually, to answer your question on the first part, it's more a matter of maybe AR, perhaps goodwill, which is a big fluff factor. That's the one thing. While I see we're waiting on somebody else to type a little sidebar on goodwill. Nobody will ever agree about goodwill. It's like valuations. You can get 3 valuations from 3 competent valuation companies that are out there. They'll never be the same. They'll always be different because it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. The same thing happens with goodwill. One doc thinks he's worth X amount of dollars. The other doc doesn't think he's worth that much. So the next question is, what is the best approach if you have a new provider joining the practice but will keep his own AR but pay a percentage of shared expenses for operational things, EHR, billing, etc. So what's going to happen here is if you're keeping their own AR, so this is what we call in the vernacular, eat what you kill. So what's going to happen here from an exit strategy standpoint, succession planning of, let's say, because you're talking about the new provider, we're talking about the older doc, if you will, the senior ones, if you will. So eventually, we talked about that 90-day or no more than 90-day run out. when the older doctor leaves, that older doctor is still going to want some sort of buyout. At a minimum, there's going to be that doctor's AR, because you mentioned all the AR is separate. So at a minimum, we've got that older doctor's, the exiting physician's AR that we have to deal with. The exiting physician will most likely want to get paid for some goodwill. And then there also may be the assets. We haven't mentioned any assets here with regards to this, just the expenses. And then as the older doctor leaves, obviously the percentage of shared expenses will change, because you have that automatically based off of either headcount or volume, or however you have that done. But the point is that when one provider leaves, that will certainly be different, and you'll have to redo that percentage. Which, by the way, as a quick sidebar, if you have any issues with your arrangement, your physician governance things, anything, here we're talking about compensation. It could be exit strategy, buy-in, buyouts. If you have any issues with anything, and you have to just eat it because it is what it is and nobody's going to deal with anything, and you finally, one doctor leaves, the senior doctor retires, for example, and you have to deal with it that way, take advantage of that after the fact to go ahead and make those changes. That's the perfect time, because now we have kind of new physicians and we have less of a legacy issue, if you will. I think I see a couple more coming in. How is it best to incorporate an exit strategy into a new physician contract separately? So with a new physician contract, so we have a couple of things here. When we have a new physicians usually join as employees, so they usually have an employment contract, which usually for whatever, a year or 2 years, however you structure it. But that usually gets kind of torn up and gets thrown away when they become a partner. And then there's actual partnership documents that are in there as partners of the practice. There may actually be a separate buy-sell agreement. Could be a separate document in the practice. If not, hopefully it's addressed in the partnership documents. But with regard to the exit strategy, that's kind of where I was getting that we create, not the LOI, that would be when you hire somebody, but as part of the partnership, we create a separate document signed by all parties, meaning all the physician partners, and certainly witnessed by the administrator. And you lay out in that document, now this could be more of a lengthy document with regards to, it could be up to, let's say, 5 pages, but it's still not that long. And it actually, this is where I was talking about with the timelines of an exit strategy, what's going to happen when for Dr. Hernandez, because he's the one that we're addressing now in this immediate term. And oh, by the way, we want to keep it in a short-term time span. So if you happen to have several other doctors that are behind that exiting, you need to kind of think about how you're going to deal with that. So it may be one document that's a little bit more narrow in scope, or it may actually address, let's say, 2 or 3 of these doctors that are leaving over a 10-year period. But bottom line is, I like to keep that as a completely separate document. For legal reasons, we don't want to wrap that into partnership type things, governance, like partnership and employment type things. You want to keep that kind of more operational, which is really what this is. At the end of the day, this is about holding them accountable for what was agreed to as far as a transition of power. So don't monkey around and put that into anything else.
Okay, Nick, I think that is all we have at the moment. Thank you again for your time today. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. The link to the recording and presentation will be distributed by each state affiliate through email. Following this webinar, you will be sent 2 brief surveys. One will ask you to rate the webinar using a 5-star scale. Then you'll be sent a separate email and link to our online webinar survey where you can provide us with feedback about today's presentation. Please take a few minutes to complete both surveys. If you're a non-member, please consider becoming a member of your respective state affiliate. This concludes our webinar. Thank you for your participation and have a wonderful day.